Hey everyone! Today we are delving into the shadows of history, where truth is stranger and darker than fiction. From poisonous and vampires to spectral legends and mummified fears, these are tales the past try to bury. So listen closely if you dare to these 5 chilling stories you probably wouldn't believe, but history swears they're true. First, we travel back to 17th century France, where a dark crime shocked the aristocracy. The woman who has become notorious for poisoning her father and brothers in 17th century France was born as Marie-Madeleine d'Aubray on the 22nd of July 1630. She was born into a wealthy French family, being the daughter of Antoine d'Aubray, an individual who held multiple offices within the French government and the administration of the capital of Paris. Foremost amongst these was a position as a Councillor of State, the equivalent of a modern-day cabinet minister, and the Master of Requests, a position which had a large amount of control over access to the French court and was consequently financially lucrative. Bribes and other payments being a regular feature of such positions in early modern Europe. As a result, Marie-Madeleine's father was wealthy, and she was his eldest child, but not a male, a circumstance which precluded her at the time from inheriting the bulk of his vast estate when he died. The chain of events which led to Brinvilliers to murder her father and brothers might be said to have begun as far back as 1651, when Marie-Madeleine was 21 years of age. At this time, she was married to Antoine Gobelin, Baron de Noailles, a wealthy minor French noble at the time. Gobelin had inherited extensive wealth through his family, which had run a famous tapestry workshop through successive generations, but Antoine himself was somewhat dissolute. He was made a marquis shortly after his marriage to Marie-Madeleine, the Marquise de Brinvilliers, thus making his wife the Marquise de Brinvilliers. But elsewhere, his life was chaotic. In particular, he was an inveterate gambler. For that reason, not only had he squandered his inherited wealth, but also the dowry of 200,000 livres which he'd acquired from Antoine d'Aubray in 1651 through his marriage to Marie-Madeleine, and by the 1660s he was actually in considerable debt. These financial woes were reflected in their marital relations. Marie-Madeleine and her husband had something of an open marriage. In particular, the Marquise was involved in a long-running affair with an officer by the name of Gaudin Sainte-Croix, an individual she had ironically enough been introduced to by her husband. Thus, although de Brinvilliers and her husband had 7 children, it is widely suspected that at least 3 of these, if not more, were actually the illegitimate product of the Marquise's affair with Sainte-Croix and others. The Marquise's father had learned about these developments by the early 1660s. His daughter's affair with Sainte-Croix especially troubled him, having a potential to ruin the family's reputation if it became well known within Parisian high society. It was in an effort to end it that Antoine d'Aubray obtained a letter from the king Louis XIV ordering the arrest of Sainte-Croix of some spurious charges. He would serve a considerable sentence at the Bastille prison in Paris in the mid-1660s. d'Aubray's actions infuriated de Brinvilliers, compounding an already toxic situation. Accordingly, by 1663, a set of circumstances had developed, which led to the Marquise's crime several years later, being her lover's incarceration at her father's behest, and the downward spiralling economic situation which the de Brinvilliers found themselves in, owing to the Marquis's gambling problems. All of these would eventually lead to the plot which the Marquise concocted in the years ahead. It was during the mid-1660s that the Brinvilliers developed the idea of poisoning her father and siblings in order to acquire the family's vast wealth. Various theories about this period have been promoted. One is that Sainte Croix came into contact with several individuals who were skilled at the art of poisoning while he was serving his sentence at the Bastille. Another is that the Marquise began testing various different poisons on sick patients at France's hospitals, or even that she tested the poisons on her household servants. As a result, it has been speculated that the Marquise might have been responsible for killing as many as 30 people in all. However, there is little concrete evidence to suggest that she actually did go about this activity, and it would have aroused considerably more suspicions at the time if her own household servants had been regularly falling ill. What is clear is that with the aid of Sainte Croix, who had served his prison spell, the Marquise began poisoning her father in 1666. She was a regular guest at his household and was quickly able to administer an arsenic-based poison, disguised within his food and drink. He eventually died on the 10th of September 1666, and an investigation concluded that he had simply died of natural causes. No autopsy was performed, but given that her brothers would now inherit the bulk of their father's estate, she quickly determined to poison them too. This was a more complex matter. De Brinvilliers' father had been aging, and as a supposedly doting daughter, it was easy for her to get access to his food and administer the poison, but not so with her brothers. Consequently, she elected to hire a man named Jean Amelin, more commonly known as La Chasseur, to work in the family home and administer poison as opportunities to do so presented themselves. This was a tricky matter, and it was not until September 1670 that both brothers were dead, the first Antoine having been killed in June 1670. A more comprehensive investigation than had occurred in 1666 was now undertaken by the medical and civil authorities. The death of her father, a relatively old man, had quickly been dismissed as a natural occurrence. But the passing of the two Marquises' brothers, both young, otherwise healthy men, and within just weeks of each other, aroused considerable suspicions. Many individuals suspected foul play, but nothing sinister was comprehensively uncovered, and no charges were brought at this time. Well, there was nothing discovered which linked the deaths of the brothers to their sister. Hence, for some time it appeared that de Brinvilliers' plan had worked. She was soon enjoying newfound wealth and had gotten away with her crimes. That is, at least until 1672. That year, her lover and co-conspirator, Sainte Croix, died, perhaps from an illness, though it has been speculated that he accidentally poisoned himself. Whatever led to his demise, it must have been a sudden death, as Sainte Croix had not removed a large amount of self-incriminating evidence from his residence, a development which now had fatal consequences for de Brinvilliers. When the Parisian police undertook an investigation, they quickly discovered a chest in Sainte Croix's apartments, which contained a series of incriminating evidence. These included samples of the poisons he and the Marquise had used over the years, and also a number of letters between the two, which did not openly state their crimes, but provided enough grounds for considerable suspicion to be raised. An investigation was now reopened into the deaths of the Marquise's father and her two brothers. The Marquise fled Paris when she learned what had been found. If this were not unequivocal enough confirmation of her guilt, further damning evidence was provided in early 1673. At that time, La Chasseur was apprehended and, after extensive questioning, laid out the entire details of what had taken place, including his own role in the poisoning of the two d'Aubray brothers. Poisoning was considered a particularly heinous crime in the early modern period. For instance, a cook who was suspected of having been involved in a poisoning intent was punishable to death by being boiled alive. La Chaussee's end was not this bleak, but he was tortured before being executed on the 24th of March 1673. When her crimes were discovered, de Brinvilliers fled from France in 1673. She spent the next 3 years on the run, though surprisingly, she did not venture widely away from France, first taking refuge across the Channel in England, and even more surprisingly, living in exile just over the northeastern border of France, in the region approximating to modern-day Belgium, but which was then part of the Spanish Empire. It was here in the town of Liège that she was finally apprehended in 1676 and extradited to France. The Marquise had been found guilty of her crimes in absentia, following her flight from France in 1673, but a new trial was nevertheless held. This was effectively a show trial. There is little doubt of that, but de Brinvilliers was not inclined to cooperate. At first, she outright denied any and all involvement in the poisoning of her father and siblings, despite considerable evidence being presented and witnesses called, which left little doubt about her guilt. Faced with the Marquise's unwillingness to admit her guilt, the authorities eventually decided that she should be tortured. De Brinvilliers' final hours were unpleasant. The method of torture she was sentenced to have carried out on her was the water cure. This involves having the mouth forced open or held open using a wedge or some other device. Copious amounts of water are then poured relentlessly into the victim's mouth, resulting in gastric distension, drowning, and even death if the cure is applied for long enough. It has been used for centuries as a torture method, and is related to the modern-day practice of waterboarding. On the 16th of July 1676, faced with the prospect of her torture, de Brinvilliers confessed to her crimes, but was nevertheless put through the water cure for 4 hours to determine if there were further crimes or plots which the authorities were unaware of. However, this revealed little of any real substance. She was then taken to the Place de Grève, a regular site of public executions in early modern Paris, and the site of the Place de l'Hôtel de Ville in the French capital today. Here the Marquise de Brinvilliers was executed on the 16th of July by having her head cut off with a sword. Her body was then burned. De Brinvilliers' death ushered in a period in French social and political history which has become known as the Affair of the Poisons. This commenced following her execution and continued through for 6 more years until 1682. The Affair of the Poisons arose largely out of an increasing paranoia amongst the Parisian aristocracy and elite about other possible attempts to poison or otherwise kill individuals involved in succession disputes. The French King Louis XIV was particularly perturbed by this. Numerous further trials of individuals followed, often on dubious grounds, while the police and security forces of the French capital began rounding up fortune tellers, alchemists, and others who might be suspected of producing poisons. Others implicated or accused included high-ranking members of the French aristocracy, such as Olympia Mancini, the Countess of Soissons, who was eventually exiled from France as a result, though not executed. The Affair of the Poisons eventually resulted in the execution of 36 individuals before it ended in 1682, while a further 23 people were exiled from France. At one point, hundreds of individuals were under suspicion or had warrants for their arrest issued. Hence, the actions of Madame de Brinvilliers created a major controversy within French society, which had a bearing far beyond her own deeds. Perhaps unsurprisingly, given how much the incident dominated French high society in the 1670s and into the early 1680s. De Brinvilliers' actions have been memorialised in several forms, particularly during the 19th and early 20th centuries, when Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Alexandre Dumas both composed works based on her life and crimes. Our next tale takes us to the grand courts of Bohemia, where the death of a noble woman would spark whispers of vampires and eternal unrest. The woman who would one day become Eleanor von Schwarzenberg was born as Eleanor Elizabeth Amalia Magdalena on the 20th of June 1682 in the town of Melnik, in the region which was then known as Bohemia, but which today encapsulates the Czech Republic. Eleanor's father was Prince Ferdinand August of the House of Lobkowitz, a noble family of the region which could trace its roots back to the 14th century and which was accordingly one of the oldest and most respected aristocratic lineages in 17th and 18th century Bohemia. Ferdinand was also the second Duke of Sagan, his father, Václav Eusebius, having purchased this title and estate in 1646. Eleanor's early life is relatively unremarkable, and there is little documentary evidence concerning it. We can assume that she would have received a typical education for an aristocratic woman in the late 17th century, with an emphasis on dancing and court etiquette, while she would most likely have learned some Latin and almost certainly French, which was becoming the lingua franca of the aristocratic courts of Europe by this time. On the 7th of December 1701, when she was 19 years of age, Eleanor was married to Adam Franz Karl Eusebius, at the time the heir apparent to the princedom of Schwarzenberg, a major principality within the Archduchy of Austria. This was a major aristocratic title in Bohemia, while the Schwarzenberg title stretched back to the High Middle Ages, and Adam would eventually succeed as the Prince of Schwarzenberg in 1703. His marriage to Eleanor, as with so many other aristocratic unions of the early modern period, was effectively a financial transaction and alliance. In such arrangements, the bride's father would typically provide a large dowry to the groom's father. Hence, one side would gain financially, but the bride's family would usually marry upwards in social status if a substantial enough dowry could be provided. This was certainly the case with Eleanor, who, although coming from an aristocratic family, was marrying into a more prestigious one. In return, Adam's father, Prince Ferdinand Wilhelm, was to receive a dowry of 20,000 guilders, or gold coins, a huge sum. 3,000 guilders were to be paid up front, with the rest due in installments in the years to come. Eleanor and Adam's marriage was fraught with difficulties from its very inception. When the union was negotiated between their respective fathers, Adam had been in a relationship with the daughter of the Austrian ambassador to Rome, whom he had married in secret. In order to facilitate the marriage to Eleanor, Adam had been forced to quickly annul this secret marriage. This poisoned the relationship between Eleanor and her new husband right from the beginning. Also, things would not improve. Well, Eleanor did not become pregnant in the months, and indeed years that followed. When a child did come, it was a girl named Maria Anna, who arrived into the world in December 1706. Yet, no male heir to preserve the direct line of the Prince of Schwarzenberg appeared. As if these issues were not bad enough, the relationship between Eleanor and Adam was further complicated when Eleanor's father married Adam's sister, Maria Elizabeth. With this, Eleanor's father also became her brother-in-law, an unsettling arrangement. Moreover, friction arose after this as Ferdinand was failing to meet his dowry payments to Adam. On top of that, Eleanor miscarried during another pregnancy in 1709, and then accusations of infidelity arose against her. As a result of all of this, the couple spent much of the 1710s estranged from each other and living in separate residences. But reconciliation was eventually brought about in 1719. That year, Adam inherited an enormous estate in Bohemia following the death of his aunt. With this, the arguments over Eleanor's dowry suddenly became largely redundant, and the tensions between Adam and Eleanor's father had already ended when Ferdinand died in 1715. Then, in 1722, the elusive male heir Joseph Adam was born. Hence, after over 20 years of fractured and unhappy marriage, Adam and Eleanor's union finally seemed to be settling down. Life with the von Schwarzenbergs was relatively peaceful and uneventful during the 1720s as they raised their young son. Throughout the 1720s, Adam had risen in the ranks of the Bohemian nobility, finding favour with the Archduke of Austria and Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI, who also ruled as King of Bohemia with the regnal title of Charles II there. Under Charles, Adam had already been made Chamberlain of the Geheimrat, effectively Charles's advisory council or the government cabinet in the 1710s. Then in 1722, he was appointed to a senior position within the royal household in Vienna. Therefore, Adam and Eleanor spent much of their time during the 1720s at the imperial capital in Austria. Finally, Adam was made a member of the Order of the Golden Fleece, the senior chivalric order within the lands of the Archduchy of Austria. Given his senior position within the Austrian territories, it is hardly surprising to find that Adam was a regular hunting companion of Charles's. But it is altogether more surprising that this pastime cost Adam his life. On the 10th of June 1732, Adam joined Charles on a hunting trip at Brandeis, near Prague. It would prove to be a fateful decision. Later that day, Charles, who suffered from poor vision, shot Adam after mistaking him for a deer, though other accounts claimed he just happened to be in the line of fire. Adam died the following day from his wounds. Following his death, Archduke Charles, no doubt riven by guilt at having killed his longtime friend and advisor, took Eleanor's son Joseph under his wing, and bestowed a large pension on Eleanor. Thereafter, she spent her remaining years managing the von Schwarzenberg estate. Sadly for the princess, in the late 1730s her health began to rapidly deteriorate. At the time, it is said that she became extremely skinny and weak, and as medical interventions were still very primitive, Eleanor turned to folk remedies to try and cure her ailments. These included the use of narwhal horn, the tusk of an Arctic whale, which was referred to as a unicorn horn in early modern Europe, and which was more valuable than gold by weight, owing to belief in its medicinal properties. Though we now know that the use of narwhal horn would not have been in any way beneficial in curing her condition. During this time, her condition continued to worsen, hardly being able to eat, drink or sleep, only resting at certain times during the day. Also, claims surrounding her life state that she was extremely pale and because of her illness began to employ various witches, alchemists and others with strange appearances in hopes that she could improve. Because of this, as well as the fact that Charles had accidentally killed her husband, he decided to send Eleanor one of his best doctors. The doctor eventually arrived at the Schwarzenberg estate, apparently claiming that she looked like a walking corpse and that her room was constantly shaded as sunlight disturbed her. It was subsequently claimed that Eleanor also kept caged wolves in the basement of her estate, as she had spent years drinking their milk to improve her fertility, though it seems that these rumours are unfounded. With the passage of time, Eleanor continued to worsen and was in immense pain. Apparently, her screams became a fairly frequent occurrence at her palace, terrifying all who heard them. Finally, after years of suffering, she eventually died at the Palais Schwarzenberg in Vienna on the 5th of May 1741 at the age of 58. Following her death, an autopsy was performed and it confirmed that she has what we now know as cervical cancer. She was also suffering from several tumours, one of which was larger than a tennis ball. Before she died, she asked that her heart be buried next to her husband, while her body was buried in the church of St. Vitus Český Krumlov in the Czech Republic. At the time, fear of vampires was very much a real thing. so much so that local townspeople began disinterring the bodies of the recently deceased, chopping off their heads, afraid that they may be vampires. Meanwhile, some had stakes driven through them and others were burnt. Legend has it that some locals were convinced that the princess had become a vampire and that she was seen walking through the nearby towns and cemeteries after her death, while other more far-fetched tales claim that she was seen biting the corpses of the recently deceased, sucking out their blood. For years after this, stories of vampires continued to circulate in the region, and supposedly, for some time her name was considered damned, but eventually, these tales faded into myth, and these rumours were forgotten. Yet, due to the strange circumstances surrounding the end of her life, as well as Eleanor's medical history, it may be possible that some townsfolk actually believed her to be a vampire, or in some way related to the occult. Yet there is little concrete evidence from the time to confirm this. The legends surrounding her life are many, and it can be hard to separate the fact from the fiction. But despite this, in recent years she has been labelled as a vampire princess. But why? In 2007, Eleanor was the subject of a major investigative documentary which premiered on Austrian television entitled Die Vampire Prinzessin, or The Vampire Princess in English. This documentary speculated that Eleanor had engaged in vampirism and was the inspiration for Dracula, the great Gothic horror novel written by the Irish Victorian novelist Bram Stoker and published in 1897. The belief that Eleanor might have been the basis for Bram Stoker's magnum opus certainly has some arguments in its favour. For example, Dracula once had an alternative first chapter to that which was eventually published in 1897. This earlier draft version indicates that Stoker was actually inspired not by a man, but a woman. Moreover, this woman was a princess of the Austrian state, and references in the manuscript version refer to the region in the modern-day Czech Republic, where Eleanor would have lived in the first half of the 18th century. In addition to this, it was claimed that Eleanor had earlier been the inspiration for a poem entitled Lenore, written in 1773 and published the following year by the German author Gottfried August Berger. This was a Gothic ballad which, while not really featuring a typical vampire, had elements of vampirism in it, and is seen as having been a major early influence in the development of vampire literature. The poem is set in Bohemia around the von Schwarzenberg estate, and the titling of Berger's poem as Lenore, an abbreviated version of Eleanor, led the documentarians in 2007 to claim that Eleanor had been the basis for Berger's work in addition to Bram Stoker's over 100 years later. Yet, these attributions are quite circumstantial, as was the other evidence presented in the documentary The Vampire Princess. For instance, it was claimed that the folk remedies Eleanor utilised to try and cure her ailments were indicative of a form of occultism. But in pre-modern times, such folk remedies were very widely used throughout Europe. But perhaps the most interesting piece of evidence presented by the documentarians to assert that Eleanor had dabbled in vampirism and had consequently been the inspiration for both Berger's and Stoker's works concerned the von Schwarzenberg's family crypt in the town of Český Krumlov in the south of Bohemia. Here, both Eleanor and her husband Adam had been buried in the church of St. Vitus, but Eleanor's heart was removed and placed in an urn which was then interred in a small cellar on the left side of the chapel next to Adam's heart. Today, a plaque over the cellar reads, "Here are stored the hearts of Adam and his wife Eleonora, princes of Schwarzenberg and dukes of Krumlov." By modern sensibilities, this is perhaps a strange case. Modern funerary and burial traditions do not generally have people removing the hearts of the deceased and interring them separate to their bodies, and the makers of Die Vampire Prinzessin were very anxious to stress that this was indicative of some form of occultism on Eleanor's part. Yet, By the standards of 18th century Central Europe, there was nothing too uncommon about this. Indeed, the royal family, the Habsburgs of Austria, had a similar tomb constructed in Vienna, in which the hearts of senior members of the family were interred separate to their bodies. As such, there is little concrete evidence to corroborate the argument that Princess Eleanor von Schwarzenberg was someone who engaged in vampirism and was accordingly the inspiration for Bram Stoker's Dracula. Thus, the legends regarding her life, referring to Eleanor as a vampire princess, despite being fascinating, are likely nothing more than that, legends. Now we go to Victorian England, where Mortis Media tells us of a mysterious figure that leapt over rooftops and into legend.
On a late autumn day in 1837, a girl by the name of Mary Stevens was making her way to work at Lavender Hill, a district in what was then the south-western edges of London, and which just a few decades earlier had still been part of the countryside beyond the city. Stevens had just come from Battersea, where she had visited her parents. As she was making her way through Clapham Common between Battersea and Lavender Hill, a terrifying incident occurred, as a strange, almost demonic figure bounded out of an alleyway at her. The creature assaulted Stevens, tearing at her flesh with the claws he had instead of hands. Stevens later reported that the creature's touch was stone cold. She screamed when it attacked, and the figure was evidently startled enough by that it quickly released her and fled. This was apparently the first sighting of the entity, which would soon become known as Spring-Heeled Jack. By November of 1837, numerous further sightings had been made across London. They described a creature which was said to appear suddenly, often jumping inconceivably large distances in front of individuals or moving coaches on London's streets. Several coachmen reported having to suddenly try to stop the horses pulling their coaches as the creature appeared almost out of nowhere in front of them and then scrambled away just as quickly. Another witness claimed that the mysterious assailant had bound over a 9-foot-high wall while cackling maniacally. Within weeks, the reports of this strange entity were circulating widely across London, and many wondered just who, or what, had attacked Mary Stevens and several others. By the end of 1837, concern had grown to the extent that the Mayor of London, Sir John Cohen, published a letter in the newspaper The Times in the first days of 1838, trying to allay fears about the sightings. In it, the mayor reassures the citizens of London that this was in fact some individual dressing up and visiting many of the villages near London in 3 disguises, a ghost, a bear, and a devil. However, it was claimed that this was the result of some prank that was being played, most likely by a member of the British aristocracy, as they would have the fundings necessary to stage these elaborate hoaxes. A number of infamous sightings followed early in the year 1838. One of these occurred on the night of the 19th of February when 18-year-old Jane Alsop answered the door of her father's house in Old Ford in what is now the Tower Hamlets region of London. She later claimed that when she opened the door she found someone pretending to be a policeman wearing a large cloak. When she brought a candle out to get some light, she was attacked by the figure, who she claimed vomited blue and white flames from his mouth, and then tried to tear at her neck and arms with hands that were claw-like. After a few terrifying moments, the creature had scampered off across the fields. A police investigation followed, but it was inconclusive. One neighbor reported seeing a young man in a large cloak nearby around the time of the attack, but the only suspect was a local carpenter called Milbank, whose alibi was that he was so drunk on the evening in question that he couldn't remember where he had been or what he had been doing. Milbank had apparently claimed during one pub visit at the time that he was Spring-Heeled Jack, but police eventually concluded he was just a loud-mouthed drunk. Alsop's case may have been entirely invented in any event, as she was the only victim who claimed Jack had actually spoken to her before attacking her. Perhaps she was looking for attention. Dozens of attacks were reported in the weeks that followed from London and the surrounding region. For instance, on the last day of February 1838, Lucy Scales, who like Alsop was 18, was attacked in an alleyway in the Limehouse district of the city. She claimed Jack had breathed blue fire at her as well, and that the experience had left her hysterical. The police continued to investigate sightings like this, and a reward was offered for information. But by now, the first appearances were obviously inspiring amateur copycats, and it was becoming more difficult to disentangle actual sightings from mere rumor. The papers did not help matters, some carrying sensational stories about how people had died of fright after being assailed by Jack in the streets. By this time, the alleged characteristics of Spring-Heeled Jack had been largely established. His primary trait was said to be his agility, moving with some incredible swiftness, with an ability to leap distances of 10, 15, or even 20 feet. Some saw in this paranormal or supernatural powers, but others who continued to believe there must be a logical explanation for the phenomenon soon devised the idea that the mysterious figure had springs inserted into the heels of his shoes which propelled him upwards and allowed him to jump these large distances. Thus the name was born of Spring-Heeled Jack, which seems to have been widespread by the late spring of 1838. By the end of early summer of 1838, Spring-Heeled Jack was the talk of London and was featured regularly in the newspaper, penny dreadfuls, and even on the London stage. However, it was at the peak of his fame that reported sightings of Jack began to decline. By the end of 1838, the official reports of attacks by him had dried up in the capital, and what few instances there were of him allegedly appearing came from other parts of England, where news of the supernatural assailant was belatedly inspiring rural copycats. By 1839, the hysteria had largely subsided, and Jack became more of a literary figure than one whom people feared they may actually run into down in a London alleyway. In the course of 1840, he developed a kind of folklore persona as a species of supernatural highwayman, one who was believed to attack solitary travellers on the roads out of London. Occasionally, an alleged attack was officially reported. Such was the case of a woman who was assaulted in Teignmouth in 1847, and police considered that Spring-Heeled Jack may have returned to terrorize the city's inhabitants 10 years after his first appearance. More distantly, the spectre of Spring-Heeled Jack was raised again in the early 1870s, when there were reported ghost sightings in quick succession at Peckham in southeast London and in Sussex. The last reports of people believing Spring-Heeled Jack had returned seem to have occurred in Liverpool in 1904, over 65 years after the first sighting of him in London. In seeking to understand the phenomenon of Spring-Heeled Jack, historians and cultural commentators alike have offered differing opinions and theories to explain the entire episode. Some have sought answers in the paranormal. For instance, many 20th century writers suggest Jack was an alien of some kind, while others have considered that Jack was some sort of half-man, half-monster, a cryptozoological entity not unlike Bigfoot or the Chupacabra. Occultists have also been keen to argue that Jack was an instance of a devil or some other demon-like creature revealing itself. In this theory, Spring-Heeled Jack was summoned by occultists or another proponent of dark magic and ran riot around Greater London before being recalled to the underworld in 1838. Others have still contended with any supernatural element which was involved with actually occurring in the minds of Jack's first alleged victims. This view holds that the first sighting of Jack by people like Mary Stevens were that as the result of people being drugged, inebriated, or mentally disturbed. In this theory, the first sighting or two were figments of people's imagination, and then those that followed were the result of hysteria or copycats. One theory which gained considerable traction at the time and which was alluded to in the letter which the Mayor of London published in the Times in January of 1838, was that Spring-Heeled Jack was an elaborate ruse that was being orchestrated by some member of the nobility. This theory at the time held that some noble had lost a bet, and the payment was to fabricate the appearance of some supernatural being around London. And there is some credibility to this. A member of the British aristocracy would certainly have had sufficient money to finance an elaborate scam like this, as there was no shortage of high-stake betting tables around 19th century London, where a wager of this nature may have been made. Indeed, so popular was the belief in this theory that there was a considerable discussion of who the noble in question may be. Most had settled on the idea that the Irish peer Henry de la Poer Beresford III, Marquess of Waterford, was responsible. Beresford was a young noble in his mid-20s at the time and had been in the newspapers regularly for fomenting public disturbances with a posse of drunken hangers-on that he kept as his entourage. For instance, in April 1837, they had arrived inebriated to Melton Mowbray, where they attacked a toll booth keeper and a police constable and covered them with red paint. Beresford was regularly in and out of court facing charges for the Melton Mowbray incident and other episodes of hooliganism in the mid to late 1830s. Consequently, many people at the time formed the view that he had financed somebody who knew how to breathe fire and dress up and had some sort of spring boot that gave him the additional look of someone who could bound and jump abnormal distances. It's not entirely implausible, but one which cannot be proven beyond reasonable doubt. However, the story of Spring-Heeled Jack might also be an instance of Occam's razor. The theory is that the simplest explanation for something is the most likely one. In this case, the most likely explanation is that a society which was prone to believing in legends about gothic monsters and the supernatural was primed to blow a folk tale which was developed in 1837 completely out of proportion. In the 19th century, tales of the supernatural and gothic horror abounded. There were regular reported sightings of ghosts and other entities in the city of London from the 1800s onwards. By the time Spring-Heeled Jack suddenly started appearing in London tales of the supernatural, horror stories and that of monsters were being published and finding huge audiences across England in the shape of the penny dreadful, cheap pulp fiction publications. This was also the century of Edgar Allan Poe's Gothic horror tales, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and Bram Stoker's Dracula. In this environment, it's quite plausible that the story of Spring-Heeled Jack was based on some unexplainable, unusual occurrence in late 1837, and most of what followed thereafter was down to people letting their imagination get the best of them at a time when people were already primed to believe in the supernatural and characters straight out of penny dreadfuls. As William of Ockham noted, the most obvious explanation is the most likely one.
Next, we travel to a quiet corner of Germany, haunted by a veiled woman and a name shrouded in secrecy. The mystery of the Dunkelgrafen begins on the 7th of February, 1807. That day, a covered carriage arrived at the town of Hildburghausen in Thuringia in central Germany. When it arrived, a couple got out. The man was in his late 30s at the time, but the woman was some years younger, perhaps nearing her 30th year, or so observers would have estimated at the time. Who were they? Many in the town asked. But in the years that followed, virtually nothing was uncovered, and instead, the mystery simply deepened. The mysterious couple took up residence in a modest dwelling in Hildburghausen over the next 3 years. He went by the title and name of Count Wawel de Versailles, while pains were taken to never reveal her identity. There was little explanation about who they were and where they had come from. Most curiously, why were a count and his female companion, whom he stressed was not his wife or partner of any kind, relocating to the remote Hildburghausen? Were they perhaps hiding from something, or from someone? In 1810, the couple moved into Eishausen Castle. near the town but in a secluded region, and when they did, they largely remained there. They rarely if ever left the castle and lived a kind of self-imposed exile outside Hildburghausen. On those rare occasions when they did leave Eishausen, the woman in particular was elusive, usually riding wherever she needed to go in a carriage and with a veil covering her face. This went on for a long time, and the villagers of Hildburghausen and the surrounding region soon began to refer to the couple as the Dunkelgrafen, or Dark Counts, on account of the shadowy nature of their identity. After decades of reclusion in Eishausen Castle, she eventually died on the 28th of November 1837, while the supposed Count lived a further 8 years until 1845. At the time of her death, the woman was recorded as Sophie Botter, and she was buried on Schulersberg Hill near the castle in a garden which the couple had purchased several years earlier. The Count was laid to rest in the churchyard of Eishausen, while the castle was torn down in 1873 after lying vacant for some years. This was all very peculiar. The couple had died having lived in the region under strange circumstances for upwards of 40 years in the case of the Count. Thus, even years after their deaths, the residents of Hildburghausen continued to wonder who the strangers who had lived in their midst for so many years had been, and one theory above all became popular. Following the Count's death in 1845, it was soon revealed that the man had actually not been a Count at all. Rather, he was a Dutchman by the name of Leonardus Cornelius van der Valk, who had acted as a secretary in the Dutch embassy in Paris between the summer of 1798 and the spring of 1799. So why had he lied and pretended to be a minor aristocrat? Also, if he wasn't a count, but rather a humble bureaucrat, how would he and his female companion have been able to purchase a castle and live there without working or earning an income for decades? The answer many people increasingly believed was that the man was a lifelong chaperone of sorts for none other than Marie-Thérèse Charlotte, the daughter of King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette of France, both of whom had been killed by the French revolutionary government back in 1793 following the French Revolution. Let's backtrack to consider who Marie-Thérèse was. She was born at the Palace of Versailles outside Paris on the 19th of December 1778, the eldest child of King Louis XVI and his Austrian-born queen, Marie Antoinette. Marie-Thérèse was the only one of her parents' 3 children who would survive into adulthood. She had 2 younger brothers, Louis Joseph, born in 1781, and Louis Charles, born in 1785, both of whom succumbed to tuberculosis when they were 7 and 10 years of age respectively, though Louis Charles's death may have been accelerated by inhumane treatment at the hands of the revolutionary government in Paris in the early 1790s. In 1789, the French Revolution broke out across France. By the end of the year, Marie-Thérèse and her parents were being held under house arrest in Paris by the revolutionaries. For a time, Louis and Marie were allowed to remain as king and queen of the country as figureheads, but when they continued to conspire with foreign governments to have Austria, Britain and other countries intervene in France on their behalf, the French government eventually decided to place the monarch and his consort on trial. Both were found guilty of treason and executed in the course of 1793. With the death of her little brother 2 years later, Marie-Thérèse was the last member of the family alive. By 1795, the former princess was deemed to pose little threat to the revolutionary government. The monarchy had been brought to an end, a republic had been established, and the French revolutionary armies had gone from being on the defensive against the British, Austrians and others to being on the offensive, conquering the Low Countries early that year and establishing the Batavian Republic there as a close ally. Consequently, the possibility of Marie-Thérèse being used by the foreign powers as a figurehead to re-establish the monarchy seemed remote, and she was allowed to leave France and head to her mother's family in Vienna in Austria. And here is where the plot thickens. Marie-Thérèse was incredibly traumatized by the years she had spent in captivity. There is no denying that. As a result, some people came to believe that the woman who arrived to Vienna in 1795 claiming to be Marie-Thérèse was in fact her foster sister. This woman was Ernestine de Lambriquet, a child of two royal servants who had worked at the Palace of Versailles in the 1770s and 1780s. Ernestine bore a resemblance to the royal children, and rumours abounded that King Louis was her actual father. Whatever the truth of this, she became a playmate of Marie-Thérèse, and when her mother died in 1788, the king and queen adopted her, although her father was still alive. During the tumultuous years which followed, Ernestine was not held captive with the rest of the royal family, but she was often mistaken for being Marie-Thérèse, and was insulted as she walked the streets of Paris. Such was the resemblance between her and the king and queen's biological daughter. And it was this resemblance which led many people to believe that when Marie-Thérèse allegedly arrived to Vienna in 1795, it was actually Ernestine de Lambriquet pretending to be Marie-Thérèse. This theory suggests that Marie-Thérèse was so traumatized by the events of the years between 1789 and 1795 that when she was released, she simply wanted to spend her life in isolation, away from court circles and governments elsewhere, who would only try to use her as a pawn in the wars as the British, Austrians and others remained in conflict with France for much of the period down to 1815. Consequently, the theory of the Dunkelgrafen holds that the woman who was travelling around Europe's courts for decades after 1795 pretending to be Marie-Thérèse was actually Ernestine de Lambriquet, while the woman who pulled up in a carriage to Hildburghausen in the spring of 1807 and became known as the Dark Countess was actually the French princess, who had been in hiding away from the world which had left her so traumatized. For many years the mystery continued to deepen. Research was conducted by many historians and hobbyists into the mysterious Dark Countess and the Dunkelgrafen. Much of this added to the speculation. For instance, it was revealed that the Austrian court had specifically requested that Ernestine de Lambriquet, Marie-Thérèse's childhood friend and companion, should be allowed to travel with her to Vienna in 1795. But at this time it was reported back that Ernestine could not be located. Perhaps many speculated this was because Ernestine was now in Paris, pretending to be Marie-Thérèse, and ready to head to Vienna as such. Additionally, research into the party of individuals who were believed to have travelled across Europe from Paris to Vienna with Marie-Thérèse in 1795 uncovered some highly unusual anomalies. Several members of the small party could not be identified, and some of them were said to have never reached Vienna. These curious circumstances did not prove anything, but they did serve to add further uncertainty to the surrounding events. Eventually, the speculation led to concerted efforts to uncover the truth, and modern science has created the possibility of being able to finally decipher the mystery of the Dunkelgrafen. Thus, in 2013, the grave of Sophie Botter, the Dark Countess, was excavated near Eishausen Castle. After her remains were exhumed, 2 small sections of her femur were sent to forensic labs in Austria and Germany to be analysed. Once this was done, the mitochondrial DNA was then assessed with that of Prince Alexander of Saxe-Cosafe, a contemporary descendant of Queen Marie Antoinette. If the Dark Countess was Marie-Thérèse, then Prince Alexander's mitochondrial DNA would be an exact match with that found in the remains located in Sophie Botter's grave next to Eishausen Castle. Unfortunately, the result proved immensely disappointing for many. It was discovered that the Dark Countess was not a relative of Queen Marie Antoinette, and so she couldn't have been Marie-Thérèse. Therefore, the mysterious couple who arrived to Hildburghausen in 1807 and lived there for over 30 years down to their deaths were probably exactly what they most obviously appeared to have been: an independently wealthy couple of individuals who wanted to live a reclusive life in a castle in rural Germany. For our final tale, we are going to Manchester, where one woman's fear of being buried alive led to an even more chilling fate. The strange story of the Manchester mummy doesn't start with a ruler of ancient Egypt as you might think, nor does it involve an Egyptologist, the name for archaeologists and historians of ancient Egypt. Instead, it starts with Hannah Beswick, a well-off but otherwise unremarkable woman from Manchester. Hannah was born in 1688 at Cheatwood in Oldhall, on the outskirts of Manchester. At this time the northern city was little more than a sleepy town, as the Industrial Revolution that would transform it was still nearly a century away. Her parents were John Beswick and Patience Beswick. They were a wealthy business family at a time when the cloth industry was already considerable in the greater Yorkshire and Lancashire region. Thus, when her father died in 1706, when Hannah was entering her late teens, she inherited a substantial fortune from him. This amounted to thousands of pounds, millions in today's money. With it, she purchased the manor of Bircham Bower at Hollingwood near Oldham, a suburb of Manchester today, though an entirely separate town at the time. Here she lived out a somewhat unremarkable life, until her death in February 1758, when she was probably 69 years of age. Yet, she was something of an eccentric, burying much of her fortune in 1745, when the Jacobite rebellion in Scotland that year threatened to expand into northern England, and did for a time. She apparently never retrieved the buried money, and never told her relatives where it was, leading to treasure hunts around Bircham Bower in modern times. By now you might be asking, where does the mummy come into all of this? Well, it all relates to the phenomenon of live or premature burials that happened in early modern Europe, and a strange incident involving Hannah Beswick's brother, which had a lasting impact on her psychology. To better understand Hannah Beswick's story, we first need to look at premature burials, which were not all that uncommon at the time. A premature burial is where an individual is buried in a coffin as part of a Christian burial, only for he or she to wake up alive underground. This could happen for a number of reasons. Sometimes, people fell into a coma and woke up buried alive in a coffin as their loved ones were convinced they were dead. Other times, rare illnesses such as lock-in syndrome could make a person appear to be deceased, and so a funeral and burial took place. More commonly, it was maybe people entering into a completely catatonic state that may have convinced others that they had passed. Whatever the cause might have been, the problem in early modern times was that a lack of medicinal and scientific knowledge often led to a premature diagnosis that someone was dead. Especially in rural areas, there were usually very few people capable of making any sort of informed decision on whether a person was dead or not. Even a procedure like checking for a pulse, one which seems so simple we take it for granted today, might not have been engaged in hundreds of years ago. Unsurprisingly, many people ended up in a coffin while they were still alive. The numbers have been fairly widely debated and can't be determined with any precision, but scholars of the subject believe that thousands were buried alive across Europe every year in early modern times. The physician J. Stenson Hooker estimated the figure to be around 800 annually in England and Wales alone. As was to be expected, some people were very concerned that this might happen to them. Hannah Beswick was one such individual, and she went to extreme lengths to make sure she didn't fall prey to such a fate. Hannah Beswick's path to becoming the Manchester mummy began with the funeral of her brother James one day in the early 1750s. The exact date is unfortunately unrecorded. James's funeral began much like any other, with people attending a Christian religious ceremony, followed by the transit of his body to the graveyard. As James's corpse was about to be sealed up and lowered into the ground, one of the mourners noticed something unusual. James, it seemed, was blinking. The person quickly let this be known, and a further examination of his corpse by Dr. Charles White, a young doctor at the time, revealed that James Beswick was alive after all. The mourners took his coffin back to his house, where he regained full consciousness a few days later from whatever was ailing him. James's close brush with being buried alive had an immense impact on his sister Hannah Beswick. We could say that she now developed taphophobia, the fear of being buried alive. But whether we can call it taphophobia in this instance is, of course, open to debate. A phobia is generally something which contains an element of irrationality to it. However, having seen her brother very nearly buried alive a few years earlier, Mrs. Beswick's fear that the same thing might happen to her was entirely justified. In any event, it would soon lead to an extraordinary development. Hannah Beswick died just a few years after the near-life burial of her brother. It was soon revealed that she had gone to great lengths to ensure that she would not be buried alive herself. In July 1857, she had amended her will to bequeath £100 to Dr. Charles White, the same doctor who had declared her brother to in fact be alive at his graveside a few years earlier. With this, the doctor was to ensure that once she died, Hannah's body was not to be buried, instead being kept around above ground indefinitely, where he was to perform regular checks to ensure she had not mistakenly been identified as having passed away. There were ways, of course, of dealing with taphophobia. Such was the fear of being buried alive in late medieval and early modern times that several devices had been employed to prevent it ever happening. One such measure was a safety coffin. This is a coffin fitted with a mechanism to prevent premature burial. One type of safety coffin included a lever that could open the coffin from the inside. This was all fine and well, so long as the coffin was not yet underground. But it is hard to see how this would work if there was 6 feet of mud on top of the coffin weighing down the lid. Several other devices like a ringing bell could also be employed, but White elected for an altogether different method after Beswick died in 1758. Hannah Beswick's taphophobia only partially explains how the Manchester mummy came about. The other part of the explanation lies in the rather eccentric decisions of Dr. Charles White. He could have chosen a wide range of methods to preserve Hannah's body in order to fulfill her last wishes, but from amongst them he chose the unusual method of mummification. There was seemingly no reference in Beswick's will that she wanted to be embalmed, yet White went ahead and did this anyway. After waiting for a sufficiently long time to ensure that she was in fact dead, White decided to double down on her request not to be buried. Turpentine and vermilion were injected into the corpse's arteries and veins, the organs were removed, and as much blood as possible was extracted from the body. After being washed in spirits, the organs were then reinserted and the cavities of the body were packed with substances like resin and camphor. Finally, the body was anointed with oils and placed into a sarcophagus filled with plaster of Paris. Hence was born the Manchester mummy. Why White did this is not entirely clear, though it was largely tied into a legal dispute surrounding Hannah's will. In order to receive the £100 that was bequeathed to him, a considerable sum of money at the time, White believed he would have to prove that he had preserved her body in some way without burying it, as per her instructions. He may also have been inspired by a scientific desire to understand how mummification worked, and by then he was a pioneer in the fields of surgery, obstetrics, and orthopedics. There was now the tricky matter of where the Manchester mummy was to be stored. For a time, her embalmed body was kept at Ancoats Hall, a large manor owned by another member of the family. But her relatives soon became uneasy with having the macabre remains of Hannah in their home, and the mummy was returned to White after a short period. Thereafter, for seemingly the rest of his life, down to 1813, some 55 years after Hannah died, White kept the Manchester mummy on display in an old large freestanding clock case. The curiosity soon attracted attention, and over the decades many people paid a small fee to visit White's house and see the Manchester mummy. When White died in 1813, the Manchester mummy was inherited by a colleague of his, a Dr. Ollier, who had possession of it for the next 15 years until he himself died in 1828. Then it was given to the Museum of the Manchester Natural History Society. It was at this juncture that Beswick's emballed remains became known as the Manchester Mummy. In an age of scientific curiosity, and when world fairs and expositions were all the rage, the museum capitalised on their strange display, and Beswick's mummy became quite a sensation in the mid-19th century. The odyssey of Hannah Beswick's remains would finally come to an end in 1868, 110 years after her death. The previous year, the Museum of the Manchester Natural History Society was subsumed into the New Manchester Museum. As its collections were being transferred and recategorised, the Manchester Mummy became something of a controversial issue, as some religious figures and politicians began arguing it was unacceptable that the remains of an 18th century woman who had not been given a proper Christian burial should be on public display in this fashion. A legal case followed, in which it was concluded that Hannah Beswick was certainly legally dead at this point, and so her desire to not be buried in the off chance she might still be alive needs no longer be complied with. Thus, on the 22nd of July 1868, Hannah Beswick was buried in Arbour Hay Cemetery in Manchester. She was almost certainly not alive when she was buried. In the years after her death and before her burial, her home Birchen Bower was converted into apartments, and several of the residents claimed to have seen a figure dressed in a black silk gown and a white cap, and described it as Hannah Beswick. It would glide across her former estate and vanish at one particular flagstone. Birchen Bower was eventually demolished to make way for a factory, but sightings of her alleged ghost were still reported. With the advent of modern science and medicine, the phenomenon of premature or live burial declined considerably in the late 19th century, and all but disappeared in the 20th. There was a greater awareness of how people could fall temporarily into comas or suffer from illnesses, which might leave them appearing as though they were actually dead for days or even weeks at a time. Most importantly, doctors were trained to check people's vital signs to see if they were actually dead before the process of burying somebody began. That said, premature burials are still not unheard of. In 2013, a video emerged of a man being pulled alive from his own grave in Brazil after he had mistakenly been thought to be dead. Such instances are rare though. Instead, premature burials and taphophobia have become something which is more a feature of horror movies like 1962's The Premature Burial and 1990's Buried Alive. It even featured in the second part of Quentin Tarantino's Kill Bill films. These attest to the fear that being buried alive can still provoke in an age when it very rarely occurs anymore. Just imagine how frightening it must have been when hundreds or thousands of people were buried alive every year, and we come some way to understanding how the strange story of the Manchester Mummy came about in the first place. Thank you so much everyone for watching these chilling and legendary tales from history. I hope you found them interesting. Let me know what you thought of the tales down below in the comments, and if you want more type scary, occult, mysterious videos like this, also let me know. I hope you guys are subscribed and have notifications turned on to get all my videos as soon as I upload them. Also a huge shout out to my channel members who you can see on screen now. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.